So Exodus 33, after the golden calf had been destroyed and a great number of the people had been killed, the Lord said to Moses, "Get up, go away from here, you and the people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. Go towards the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, concerning which I swore, saying, I will give it to your descendants. And I shall send a malach in front of you." Malach is usually translated angel, but could just be a messenger. But we'll see in our second session that very often the word malach in the Torah doesn't mean a messenger, an angel, some heavenly or earthly being who is on a mission from God. Sometimes the word malach in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, can mean a small-scale manifestation of God. Toda rabah. Sometimes it can mean just God's presence, but not all of God's presence. Some body of God or manifestation of God or part of God that is only part. By the way, there's a word in Sanskrit in Hinduism, in early Hinduism, that describes the exact same idea. Does anyone happen to know? Avatar, or actually in Sanskrit, avatara. An avatara, or in English it becomes avatar, is the exact same meaning as the word malach in this sense of the word. So I think we can actually translate this, y'all go up to the land of Israel, and I will send before you an avatar, and I will expel the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites from that land, and you should go to the land flowing with milk and honey. Because I myself will not go in your midst, because you're too stubborn. I won't go with you, lest I destroy you on the way. Let me just read verses 2 and 3. I'm going to read a little selectively to focus on the parts that I want to focus on. I'll read it first in Hebrew, and I'm going to translate the parts that I'm interested in. Vishalachti lefanecha malach v'gerashti et haknaani. Ki lo e'ele b'kirbecha, pen achelcha baderech. I will send in front of you an avatar, and I will expel the Canaanites. And I will not go in your midst, lest I destroy you along the way. What's interesting, what's odd about these sentences? Who's doing the expelling, and who isn't doing the expelling? So if God fully is with them, the anger, there's going to be an occasion for anger, and it's just not going to work. So is God with them, or is God not with them, according to these two verses? Is God, in other words, is this a set of verses in which we're finding out about divine absence among the people, or divine presence? What's odd about these verses to me is this sort of interplay of divine presence and absence. On the one hand, God says, I'm not going to be among you, and yet God uses the first person to talk about what's going to happen to the Canaanites. V'gerashti. I will expel the Canaanites. So first, the malach is being sent rather than God, but does it say, and then the malach, the angel, will do the dirty work? No, the malach apparently is a part of God, because the first person verb is used, I will expel them. So I'm sending a part of myself, I'm sending this avatar, and so the work will be done by me, but I won't be fully in your presence. You're getting some idea here that God has a physical presence, but it's too much for the people, so there can be just a discrete part of that presence, which is God. That's why you get the first person verb, I will expel, the gerashti, but it isn't exactly God, or it isn't all of God. There's still some hands, but we're running out of time. I want to get a little further into this chapter, so let's keep on going. In verse 4, the people hear this, and they take this as some sort of bad news, because they go into mourning. They hear that God is no longer fully with them, and they take off all their jewelry, they go into mourning. It would be inappropriate, having heard what they just heard, to continue wearing their jewelry. In verse 6, this continues, they take off all of their jewelry. Then we're told, somewhat abruptly, in verse 7, the verb form switches. Let me see if the English it does. Yeah, in English it does this too. There's a little line, I guess, and we start getting a different kind of verb. Now Moses would take the tent, or Moses used to take a tent, and he would pitch it outside the camp, at some distance from the camp, and at this tent, God would come and talk to Moses. And there's a description of this in some detail. We won't read the whole thing, but let's say in verse 9, it would happen when Moses arrived at the tent that the pillar of cloud would come down and would stand at the entrance of the tent, and it would speak to Moses. And the whole people saw this, and when this happened, they would stand up. Verse 11, and God would speak to Moses, panim el panim, literally face to face or directly, like a human being, like a man speaks to his neighbor. And then he, Moses, would return to the tent, but his servant Joshua would stay at the tent the whole time. So here we've got another description of divine presence, and this one, it's a little odd in that it's not the next thing that happened. This is a description of something that happened again and again. The verb form being used here in biblical Hebrew describes a recurring event, something that happened not just once, but again and again over time. And God is present to some degree, but where is God present? In the cloud. So there's something visible, but not quite visible. I think the idea is that God is somewhere in the midst of this pillar of cloud so that we can't see God. So we can see that we know that God is there, but we can't see God. Paradoxically, as a result, we can look at it. If God fully were there, we couldn't look, right? Because if we did, we'd die. But because God is probably surrounded by this cloud, we're able to gaze at greater length at this cloud. So for one thing, God is in the cloud. Where is God in relation to the people when this happens? Outside the camp, not within the camp. God doesn't come into the camp itself. You Israelites, you live in your encampment. When I need to talk to Moses, or when Moses needs to talk to me, I'll come on down to this special tent, which you'll be able to see, but it's not in your midst. God is not in their midst, as we saw earlier in the chapter. God is there, but outside the camp, in the wilderness, at a little bit of a distance from the Israelite camp. So God is there, but not here. Now again, this is very different from our conception. God is not nowhere and everywhere. For us, God is invisible, non-physical, non-embodied. Therefore, God is nowhere but everywhere. This is different. God is someplace specific, over there, where we can see what surrounds God, but not here. First of all, a divinity can fragment into smaller scale divinities that retain some aspect of the God from whom they are derived, and yet have a little bit of independence as well. So that, in other words, a divinity has a certain fluidity of self, whereas myself is just myself. This is me, and you're you, and that's the end of the story. With a God, that's not necessarily the case. A God can kind of fragment so that myself might be more than one self who are all related to each other, but have a little bit of independence. That's one kind of fluidity that the gods have that we don't have. And that will mean in part that a god can have more than one body. So you've got these gods with the same name, and in ancient Near Eastern thinking, a name, a shem in Hebrew, a shumma in Akkadian, a name wasn't just a sound that represents something. A name was thought to be the essence of something. So for two deities to have the same name might be a way of saying that at their core, their very essence, they're the same goddess. But they're different goddesses because they're listed separately. You get a sense of this even more so in Roman numeral 3, which is a poem, a prayer, which the Assyrian emperor Ashurbanipal prayed to the goddesses Ishtar of Nineveh and Ishtar of Arbela. In this, he says the following: he prays, "Exalt and glorify the Lady of Nineveh, magnify and praise the Lady of Arbela, who have no equal among the great gods." Now you might have thought maybe Lady of Nineveh, Lady of Arbela are just two terms for the same goddess, but the next line clearly uses the plural form "they have," not "she has," but in the Akkadian it's very clearly "they have no equal among the great gods." Their names, the suffix here for "their" is shima. It's clearly a plural suffix and not she, which would be a singular suffix. Their names are most precious among the goddesses. Their cult centers have no equal among all the shrines. A word from their lips is blazing fire. Their utterances are valid forever. I am Ashurbanipal, their favorite. I grew up in the lap of my goddesses. The Lady of Nineveh, the mother who bore me, endowed me with unparalleled kingship. The Lady of Arbela, my creator, ordered everlasting life for me. They decreed, the form here is a feminine plural form, Ishima. They decreed as my fate to exercise dominion over all the inhabited regions. They caused kings to bow down at my feet. Now, these are clearly two different beings. The grammatical forms used are plural, or sometimes dual grammatical forms. And yet, they do the same thing. They act completely in concert. They act in parallel. They act as one. In this poem, they're grammatically separate, but at their essence and at the level of their actions, they're not separate at all. Furthermore, when we go from the poem or from these legal treaties to the realm of mythology, there's only one Ishtar. There's no myth about Ishtar of Arbela who one day, goes and visits her cousin Ishtar of Nineveh. There's just Ishtar. There's only one Ishtar. Similarly, in Canaanite texts, which I haven't given you on the handout, we have lists of many, many different Baals, but there's only one Baal in mythology. You don't have stories about different Baals who interact with each other. So that at some level, all these different gods, they are, but they are not the same. Why? Because a god is different from a human. A god can fragment into lots of local manifestations whom you can pray to separately, and yet deep down, they're all really the same. You get some sense of this fragmentation and overlap also in another text, which is Roman numeral 4, where we're told that various deities, various gods, are aspects of, more literally, are body parts of the god Ninurta. So that in this prayer to Ninurta, one says, "O Lord, your face is Shamash, who is the sun god. Your locks are Nisaba. Your eyes, O Lord, are Enlil, the god of the storm and the wind, and his wife Ninlil. Your eyeballs are Gulat and Belet Illi. Your eyelids, O Lord, are the two twins, Sin, the god of the moon, and Shamash, the god of the sun." So all these different deities, they have their own independent existence, and yet at some level, they're perceived to be parts of the god Ninurta. The priests were able to bring the presence of the god literally into the object, so that the object was no longer simply a thing, but it had become, in fact, the god's body. And you get a very clear sense of this. It's very explicit in a lot of these Pit P texts. For example, one of the Pit P texts that describes this ritual says the following. This is Roman numeral 5. The priest who's performing the ceremony is directed as follows. Into the ears of that god you speak as follows. The word God here is referring to the statue. So into the ear, and the statue, the Mesopotamian statues, they were made with eyes and ears and a nose and a mouth and so forth. These are all parts that the artisans, the goldsmith or the carpenter would have put onto the statue. So into the ears of that god, i.e. that statue, you speak as follows. You are counted among your brother gods. You whisper into his right ear, from today your destiny may be counted as divinity. With your brother gods you are counted. Another text says, on the day when the god, that is the statue, was created and the pure statue was completed, the god was made visible in all the land. He is clothed in splendor, suited to lordliness. Lordly, he is full of pride, surrounded with radiance. He is endowed with awesome radiance. He shines out splendidly. The statue appears brilliantly. In other words, he was very bright. This brightness that they describe as surrounding the statue is the brightness that surrounds a Mesopotamian deity in all sorts of Mesopotamian literature. I give you just a couple of examples of similar descriptions, let's say, of the god Asaluchi, which is another name for Marduk. But we could find similar descriptions for dozens and dozens of other gods. So the imagery, the poetic imagery that normally applies to a god is applied to the god statue, because once the mouth of the statue has been opened and cleaned, once this pit-pi, mis-pi ceremony has taken place, the statue is no longer a statue. It is now a god. There's actually one Mesopotamian text I didn't put onto the handout that actually says, until the pit-pi ceremony is performed, the god cannot smell the offerings, cannot hear the prayers. Now, some of you know from the book of Psalms, in Hallel, for example, in Psalm 115 or 116, you get the exact same language, except it's negative. The psalmist insists, their idols they can't hear, they can't see, they can't talk. But in fact, the Mesopotamians believed that they could. That the eyes, the jewelry, that the two jewels that were put to be the eyes of the statue, and the ear that was carved out of the wood, that once you did the pit-pi ceremony, it wasn't just a jewel. It was really an eye that could see. It wasn't just a representation of an ear by a sculptor. It was actually an ear that could hear. And so the god was present in the statue. They thought this really quite literally. Statues were gods. They also, from the way they wrote the word statue, it was clear that they thought a statue of a god had become a god. There was a certain way of spelling any divine name that they used for these statues. But what's interesting to me in particular, there's a lot of other scholars who have pointed this out about the pit-pi ceremony. This is my own research. What is interesting to me that I point out in my book is we need to pause to remember that there's more than one statue of Marduk. Yes, once you've made a statue of Marduk and you've performed the pit-pi ceremony, it's the body of Marduk. But there's lots of statues of Marduk all over Mesopotamia. In Marduk's temple, there's a big statue of Marduk, but you know what? Across the street from Marduk's temple is the temple of Marduk's son Nabu, and in the temple of Nabu, there is a special shrine for Marduk that has a Marduk statue. So right across the street from each other in Babylon, there are two bodies of Marduk. And that's just in Babylon. Travel a few miles outside of Babylon, you'll get to another town that has a smaller, less grand temple for Marduk, and there you'll find yet another body of Marduk. And over Mesopotamia, you'll find dozens of bodies of Marduk. What's interesting is not just that the Tsalmu, the statue, was literally the presence of the god, but that the god was present in many different places. The body of the god was present in many different places, or to put it differently, Marduk had many bodies. Ishtar had many bodies. This makes sense when you stop to think about how there's an Ishtar of Nineveh, an Ishtar of Arbela. Well, yes, literally, in the city of Nineveh, there was a main Ishtar statue. But in Nineveh, there was an Ishtar statue too. So that you get multiple bodies of any given deity. Well, this fits the fluidity model that I've been describing. A god is not limited in terms of space and time. A god can be in many different places, in many different specific places. So there's just this difference between humanity and divinity in the way that Babylonians and Assyrians think, that they can be in many places at once and we cannot. This isn't just a quantitative difference. It's not just that they're more powerful and smarter than we are. It's a qualitative difference. The nature of their being is fundamentally different than the nature of our being, because they can fragment, they can be fluid, and yet remain a single being. Marduk in the end is still just Marduk. There's only one mythology of Marduk. The stories of Marduk are all about the same Marduk. The idea that there's a geographically local form of the god Hashem may be similar or the same as what we find, similar to or the same as what we find in Mesopotamia and Canaan, where you've got these local manifestations of a particular deity. Once we've seen it there, the truth is, it shows up in the Bible too. It's just that nobody noticed it. David at one point is talking to his son Avshalom, who had fled when they had a conflict and had been living. Avshalom had been living up in an Aramean area in the Golan Heights, and he says to his father, he's now back in Jerusalem with his father David, and Avshalom says to King David, I need to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow, because back when I was living in the Golan Heights, I made a vow to Hashem of Hebron, or Hashem in Hebron, that I would sacrifice to him if I made it successfully back and safely back to Jerusalem. And so David lets him go to Hebron. Well, why couldn't he fulfill the vow in Jerusalem? He says, I made a vow to Hashem in Hebron. Now he doesn't mean that he was in Hebron when he took the vow. He was up in the Golan Heights when he made the vow. I think it's that he was making a vow to a local version of Hashem, not just to Hashem generally, not just to Hashem who is in the heavens, but to the Hashem who is in Hebron. This may be an Israelite version of this same idea. By the way, if you go to shul on Friday night, one of the things that you recite, if you get there early enough, for Kabbalat Shabbat is Adonai B'Tzion Gadol. Adonai Asher B'Tzion, actually, Gadol. Hashem who is in Zion is great. This may be another example of this localized manifestation of Hashem. So it may be that the idea that there is a local fragmentation of, small-scale manifestation of Hashem. I'm using the word Hashem, obviously, for the Israelite God, instead of pronouncing his personal name, which we don't pronounce out loud. But the idea that there's a local Hashem in various different places, this would be just another example of this ancient Near Eastern idea that a God can have a local manifestation, a small-scale manifestation. This is probably what some of the texts call a malach or an avatar. Hashem Asher B'Chevron, Hashem B'Tzion, these are probably local avatars of the universal heavenly God called Hashem. That's one reason that this is interesting. This text reminds us of the local version of Hashem. Is that what is this thing, Hashem's Asherah? Now, Asherah is a word that has several meanings. One meaning is it's simply the name of a goddess. One possibility is that this is Hashem's wife. And many scholars think that this is a reference to Hashem having a wife, which from the point of view of the Bible is a heretical idea, but that doesn't mean that lots of Israelites didn't believe it. Other scholars, however, point out that in Hebrew grammar, a personal name never takes a pronominal suffix, never takes the word his. Like the word his or hers or its in Hebrew, you can smush it right onto a word as a suffix. Like, kosi is a way of saying my cup. Instead of hakos sheli, I can say, in slightly fancier Hebrew, kosi, or koso, his cup. That O sound, or that E sound, that is a suffix that represents a pronoun, and that kind of pronominal suffix never goes on to a name in Hebrew or Canaanite generally. And therefore, these scholars point out that Asherato cannot mean his wife whose name was Asherah. It can't mean his Asherah any more than you would say in Hebrew, like, his Sarah or his Rachel. You just don't say that in Hebrew. Therefore, these scholars, and I agree with them, proposed that Asherato has to have its other meaning. The other meaning of the word Asherah is a stick, a wooden stick, or a pole that is sacred to a god or a goddess. Actually, Philo of Byblos, whom I quoted on the previous page, that Canaanite Phoenician writer who wrote a book in Greek, he actually refers to these hrabdoi, or in the singular hrabdos, to sticks that were parallel to the baitulia, to the pillars, and were sacred to a god or a goddess. So I think that the word villa asherato here, to his Asherah, refers not to his wife, to a goddess, but probably to a cultic object in his temple. In other words, in the temple in the city of Samaria, there probably was an Asherah. That is a stick or a tree. In Hashem's temple in Teman, somewhere in the south, probably near Eilat, which is where these people, this caravan station, were traveling to, there was probably a tree or a wooden pole that was sacred to Hashem. In fact, there are references elsewhere in the Bible to zealously monotheistic Israelites who apparently thought that it was okay to use an Asherah in a temple to pray to God. The Bible usually condemns these things, but some passages in the Bible make it clear that there were monotheistic Israelites who did use these Asherahs or Asherot when praying to God. So here we seem to have, I think, the idea, well, there's some sort of stick that's sacred to Hashem. That doesn't mean that it was a body of Hashem in the same way that the Tzalmu was in Mesopotamia, or the Matzeva or Beit El was, but it's a possibility that we should think about. Let's move on to another text, a biblical text. In Genesis chapter 28, this will be on the handout, so we don't need to go to our Bibles for this. Jacob woke up, we read in Genesis 28, after seeing the ladder, the famous story of the ladder. So Jacob woke up after seeing a vision of the ladder that reached from heaven down to earth, and then, having woke up, now that he was awake, he took the stone, and now here we're quoting from Genesis 28, he took the stone that he had used as a pillow, that he had set beneath his head, and he set it up as a matzeva. Now this is important. This is the same word that the Canaanites used to talk about an object into which the presence of the deity has entered. Then he poured oil on the matzeva, and he called it a Beit El. And he called the place a Beit El. Now that's very interesting, because the Beit El, we're told explicitly in the work of Philo of Byblos, this is the stone that has been enlivened, the stone that has been animated, into which the God's breath or psyche or spirit has entered. So what's going on here, I think, is that Jacob, this Israelite, was setting up a matzeva and making God come into it. It says that he poured oil on it. To pour oil on something, when do you do that in biblical religion? To anoint somebody, to anoint someone a king or a high priest. So that the point is that when you pour oil on a man's head, you're changing that man's legal status. A minute ago, this kid named David was just a shepherd, the youngest child of a particular family north of Hebron, in the little town of Bethlehem. But then the prophet Samuel poured olive oil on his head, and now he wasn't just a shepherd kid, now he was the king. No one knew it except for him and Samuel and God. But now his legal status, and even, I dare say, his metaphysical status had changed. He was now the king. Aaron, at one point, was the older brother of Moses, the older brother and sidekick of this important Israelite. And then at one point, Moses pours oil on Aaron, and now Aaron is the high priest. Now Aaron is the only Israelite allowed to perform certain kinds of sacrifices, which even Moses cannot perform. In biblical religion, and not only in biblical religion, but in Canaanite religion, in texts outside the Bible, to pour oil on something is to change its status. I believe that when Jacob pours oil on the stone, This is the Canaanite/Israelite equivalent of the Mesopotamian pit pee or mis pee ceremony, the Israelite equivalent of the Mesopotamian mouth opening ceremony that brings the presence of the God into the stone. A moment ago, this was just a stone that Jacob had rested his head on while he was sleeping. Now, God lives in this stone, and the stone, this matzeva, this pillar, suddenly has become a Beit El, a house of the God. God lives inside here now. It's not just some stone, it's a matzeva, it's a Beit El. Some years later, God appears and talks to Jacob in Roman numeral 9, Genesis chapter 31, and God identifies himself to Jacob with the following words. Anochi ha'el Beit El asher mashachta sham matzeva. Fascinating passage. I'm not going to go into all the grammar of this. Some of you who know Hebrew, if you want to ask me later about the grammar, I'll talk about this. But in good biblical grammar, we can translate those words in two ways. One is, I am the God in the Beit El, in the Bethel, that you anointed into a stele there. In other words, he's saying, I'm the God that you brought into that stone. And when you anointed that stone, you made that stone into the ritual cultic object that we call a matzeva or a Beit El. I'm the God who's in that Beit El, and we need to talk. That's one way of translating it. It could also be translated, I am the God Beit El, whom you anointed there into the stele, into the matzeva. In other words, in this translation, which is equally grammatically acceptable, God is saying, I am a God. My name, one of my names is Beit El, and I'm the deity that you put into that statue. If this second translation is true, then I think we're learning something very interesting, which is that when the God Hashem consents to become an avatar and to manifest himself inside of a matzeva, there's a name for that. When God appears, when Hashem becomes an avatar, so that we've got God's presence there, but not all of God's presence, just a tiny little bit of it, then we call him by the name Beit El. And there's some evidence that Israelites, especially in the northern kingdom, used the term Beit El as a name not of some pagan god that they were praying to, but as one of the names that could be applied to Hashem. Before, the story of Jacob wrestling with that mysterious being whose identity is somewhat mysterious, is somewhat unclear. Regardless of what Genesis is thinking about the identity of that being, we get another version of that story, or a retelling of that story in the book of Hosea. In the book of Hosea, we read the following, when in poetic form, it retells this story. So this is Roman numeral 10 on the handout. Babeten akav et achiv. In the womb, Jacob cheated his brother. Nice little pun there. The word for cheated is akav, related to the word Yaakov. No offense. Uve'ono Sarah et Elohim, and as a grown man he wrestled with Elohim, the meaning of which may not be initially fully clear, whether it's God with a capital G or gods, divine beings. Vayashar el malach vayuchal, he wrestled with a malach and endured. Now here I think the meaning of Elohim remains ambiguous, but may be clarified a bit. Malach could mean an angel, and therefore Elohim could mean divine beings, gods with a small g. But it also might mean the avatar, the small-scale manifestation of God. That is another possibility, and that's going to become stronger as we go further into the poem. Bacha vayitchanen lo, he cried and pleaded with him, Beit El yimtzaenu. It was Beit El who met him there. Beit El being the name of the God Hashem when he manifests himself in the stone pillar. So now we've got the answer. What is Elohim? What does Malach mean? Elohim here means God with a capital G. It means Hashem. But it's not all of Hashem. It's not all of God. It's the avatar. It's the small-scale manifestation that we call Malach. And remember that there's a personal name for that small-scale manifestation. When Hashem manifests himself in a Beit El, in a Matzeva, we call him by his name Beit El. So it was Beit El who met him there, and the word order here is very important. Those of you who know a little biblical Hebrew, we could talk about the grammar and the syntax, but I don't want to spend time now. You can ask me later. The correct translation of this is, it was Bethel who met him there. It's putting the emphasis on the name. Visham yidaber imo, I think is what this should read. There he spoke with him. Vadonai Elohei tzvaot, Adonai zichro. Hashem, the God of hosts, Hashem is his name. Here we're being told very explicitly by the prophet Hosea that the being with whom Jacob wrestled was God. That is to say, the small-scale manifestation or avatar whom we call the Malach, who goes by the name Beit El, and who is a manifestation of, and therefore also goes by the name of Hashem. Palestinians. There's plenty that we can disagree with, but it's not theological.